Hey everyone, thanks for coming back to Donor Conception Conversations. Today, I have a little more legal advice for you, but it's a little bit different. You're going to meet Richard Vaughn. He is a very well-known international fertility lawyer in our industry, and he does a lot of domestic but also international fertility law. So you're going to learn things about whether or not you should have an international donor. If you're an international couple, what does that mean? And all sorts of things, certainly about disclosure, about openness, about making different sorts of contracts that will be right for your family. He also talks about his own family building journey and what it means to him to have two children and be in this wonderful, happy marriage. So he's going to cover a lot of ground, and I think you'll learn a lot by tuning in. So I hope you enjoy the episode, and please feel free, as always, to reach out to me with any questions. Welcome to Donor Conception Conversations. This is a one podcast created exclusively for people who are planning to use donor conception to build their families or for people who've already used donor conception. I'm Lisa Schumann, and I'm your host, and I'm here to teach you as much as I can about how to build your family and how to have the best path to parenthood possible. I'm a therapist, I'm a researcher, and I'm an author, and I'm passionate about donor conception. And over the last few decades, I've learned so much that I'd like to share with you. So my guests and I will share the tools and the truths that you need to have a better journey to parenthood. And today, I have the wonderful privilege of Richard Vaughn coming on to the podcast. He's had the opportunity to help thousands of intended parents from all over the world build families with assisted reproduction. In addition to his busy legal practice, he devotes numerous volunteer hours to advancing for LGBTQIA intended parents and their families. And he's the immediate and past chair of the American Bar Association's Family Law Section Committee on Assisted Reproductive Technology. That's a mouthful. He is a founder and speaker of the first Cambridge University International Surrogacy Symposium, as an active member of the California Bar Association and its Family Law Section, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine's Legal Professionals Group, and the National LGBT Bar Association, and is active with Family Equality, which we all love. He has been published in professional journals and has presented at numerous legal and family building conferences around the world and is often seen in the media. He's also an experienced fitness instructor, triathlete, and a former paramedic, very talented, and a board member of the medical device company. In 2008, Rich and his spouse, Tommy Wolfeld, were married in California and became the proud parents through egg donation and surrogacy of twin sons, Aiden and Austin, which is very exciting, and I can't wait to hear all about that. So welcome, Richard. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
So did I leave anything out that you'd like to share with the audience?
The only other thing is I'm now preparing for the New York Marathon.
Oh, my goodness.
So, I don't sit still very well.
Yeah, I can see that. That's fantastic. And that's a tough one, the New York Marathon.
So I hear, but I hear most people talk about the experience of the crowds, the energy, the social aspect of it. So looking forward to it.
Oh, that's great. Well, good for you. That's great. Speaking of marathons, you had quite a marathon journey with your own family, right? I mean, you know, this is what you do, this is what you live and breathe, but you built your own family through assisted reproduction. Can you tell us a little bit about that to start?
Yes, of course. I want to say well played on the marathon connection.
Thank you.
So my husband and I met in 2000, started dating in 2001, and within a year and a half, started talking about wanting to have a family, not knowing how to do it at the time. We'd only really heard of adoption. We had some friends of ours who we came across who had actually been through surrogacy. So, of course, we went to dinner with them, got lots of information from them, referrals, recommendations, and started doing our research more informally through friend contacts. A couple of years later, we went to a local family building conference in Los Angeles. At the time, there was a group called the Pop Luck club. So it was a play on potluck. It was all gay dads getting together socially. And they had grown, and they began hosting these conferences where they would have, fertility doctors and some agencies come to explain what they do and how things work. So we went to one of those, found it incredibly informative, but overwhelming. And of course, realized that it was an expensive journey. And then we kind of put it to the side because we knew we needed to save up for this process. So fast forward a couple more years, and we got serious about starting our family and started telling people we were looking around. Someone in my husband's spin class said, "Oh, you need to talk to my friend Will. He's an attorney in this space." So we went and talked to Will. At that time, I was in the medical device company as an in-house counsel, but we had sort of lost some funding, and I had a long period of time to look for new work. So we had our consult with this guy, Will. I found it fascinating, and I called him back the next day, and I said, "What's it like to practice in this area?" So at the same time that we began our journey, I actually began working in this field. So
Wow.
long story short, I was at the right place at the right time, and they hired me. And I've been working in this field ever since 2006.
Wow.
So in the process of forming our family, we, of course, had to engage an egg donor and a surrogate. So we began our search for the donor and found one at an agency in San Diego. Started having that conversation about, what kind of donation were we looking for, an open donation, anonymous donation. And it made sense to us at the time, this was back in 2007, to make it an open donation, just to have our information out there, and not be halted by the fears that other people had expressed about, the dangers of open donation, like, these unfounded fears that a donor would come knocking on the door years later saying, "Hey, I'm your mommy," or vice versa, that, we or the kid would knock on her door saying, "You're my mom, and, we need money."
Mm-hmm.
We weren't persuaded by those fears, and we felt like it was the right thing to do to have an open donation. So we engaged the donor. I went through the legal process, ended up doing 2 cycles with the donor because we had kind of a lower production out of the first cycle, but were successful after the second cycle. Ended up engaging a surrogate as well, went through that process also with an agency, and our kids were born in 2008. We got married just a few weeks before the kids were born because there was that short window of time in California where it was legal before Prop 8 passed. And then, several years later in 2015, same-sex marriage was allowed nationwide. But we were married just a few weeks before the kids were born. And so that's how I can always remember how long I've been married and how old the kids are.
You don't get in trouble.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's so interesting. I want to hear more about this, but I just want to stop for a second, Richard, because I think what you mentioned earlier about the donor maybe wanting to be involved in the child's life is a very common fear for people. And I find that I don't know what your experience has been, but I find that both recipients and donors worry about that, right? Sometimes the donors might say to me, "Well, are the recipients going to want me to be involved in their lives?" And then the recipients say, "I'm really worried the donor is going to be involved in my life in some way or want to take these kids away." And neither is true, really. Everybody's just there to help make a baby and wants everybody to be happy, right? And so you probably see that with a lot of the clients that you work with.
Well, I've certainly heard the concerns expressed to me, but I can also share with my clients, whether I'm representing a donor or an intended recipient, that we've never seen any situation arise where someone has crossed the line in this regard. I will say there was one case where some intended parents met with a donor before they began their legal work, and they got a little too friendly and started talking about our child when it was really she was going to be an egg donor for this intended parent couple. These were friends of mine, actually. They went to dinner and had drinks, and I think got a little too excited, and I think crossed the line with some of their vocabulary, and that match fell apart.
Oh.
Because I think they everybody got a little too eager at that early stage. But in no case where parents and donors have matched together and gone forward and gone through a cycle and a retrieval and created embryos and such, have I ever seen the donor cross the line in contacting the parents or vice versa. So I think it's been a very respectful process all around. I would say that, egg donors, in my experience, they just want to do something good to help people, make a little money at it while they're doing it, but they have no interest in crossing the line and interfering in the family's lives. So yeah, I'm very happy to report there've been really no issues there.
Yeah. And I think it is understandable, right? Because when you're building your family, this is like the most intimate thing that you can do, right? You have somebody that you love and you want to make a baby with them, and sometimes you can't, right? And so you need the help from somebody else, and that can feel so strange because here's this person who feels like a stranger, and you're taking their genetics into your life. And so it's, I think, natural for people to be a little afraid or hesitant.
Absolutely. I think that's a normal human tendency to have that fear of how does this work? Will there be any problems? Those are normal questions to ask. And I do get them quite a bit. We get similar questions with surrogacy too, such as, can she take the baby? Will she change her mind? Those are the big picture fears that come in. And until the participants get educated on the process from professionals like yourself and attorneys and agencies, they will have those fears, but it's our job to help dispel those fears.
Well, I'm sure you put everyone's mind to rest quite a bit, Richard. So that's wonderful that your clients have you to help them with that. Do you find that there are other concerns that might prevent them from moving forward, or other things they feel scared about?
A lot of intended parents, especially heterosexual couples, are concerned about disclosing to their child that they used an egg donor and how to disclose. Can they keep it a secret? So that conversation will come up from time to time. And, without imposing my opinion, I try to walk them through that and talk them through sort of what we all generally in this field feel is important, which is honesty and truth, to the children, donor conceived children, because it's important for them to know. And it's certainly much less desirable for that child to later find out and then, have that child now feels like their whole life has been a lie. So I think it's better to disclose whenever possible. So that's one of the other fears that comes up quite a bit.
And you were sharing with me a little bit that you've kind of felt that way with your own family, right? Your kids are very comfortable with their origins.
Yes, of course. Now our kids have two dads, so part of the conundrum is not really much of a mystery, right? They know that we had to engage someone. Their birth had to happen somehow. So the surrogacy piece became the first part of the story in terms of, do we have a mom? No, there's no mom. You have two dads. There are all kinds of families out there, and you are special. You are wanted, and you are loved. And that was an easy hurdle to cross with the kids. Then as they got a little older, they had questions that related to, genetics. When they were 8 or 9, they started asking, if they were going to look like one of their dads when they grew up. They started to get that concept of that genetic connection. And as they grew older, as their questions grew in depth, we would expand the story. And when we felt they were ready, we would enter in the discussion about the egg donor. And I tell you, for a number of years, even though we mentioned egg donor, without getting into detail, it really just kind of went over their head. They didn't quite get that. And maybe it's because they're boys, and boys can be a little slower to learn sometimes. But by age 11, I think that's when they first started asking more questions about the egg donor. It finally started to resonate. And so we expanded the story and told them a little more. And they were fascinated, really fascinated about, especially the donor's background. They really wanted to know like her ethnicities. And they found that really exotic. And they felt even more special when they learned about her background and her family's background.
Nice.
So those conversations continued, and by age 13, they asked to see the profile. So they got to learn a lot about the donor at that time. They read the profile word for word, cover to cover, and they were truly fascinated. And they're 14 now, so that's kind of where my story of the disclosure part ends. I'm curious to see if they're going to want to meet the donor. So we'll see where that goes. But we did leave open that possibility with our egg donor by having an open arrangement where she agreed to being contacted in the future. And that's another big issue we talk a lot about with our clients as well, is whether to have an open arrangement, semi-open, or fully anonymous. So we talk about that a lot with our clients.
That's great. And it was so forward thinking for you to start to think about that. I mean, developmentally, that does kind of make sense because kids are curious about whose tummy they grew in when they were little. But as they grow older, developmentally, preteen years, that's when they understand the concept of genetics. So it sounds like they, kind of are right on track emotionally and really understand, where they come from and feel very comfortable with it, which is wonderful. And it's so nice for you to be able to say, yes, we've done this for you. We've already thought ahead, which is hard to do, right? When you're in the kind of tumult of trying to figure out what you're going to do at the fertility clinic and how you're going to understand reproduction. I mean, who even remembers their 10th grade biology class, right? I mean, there's so much to know. And then to kind of think also, I've got to make this plan for my kids for the future is very forward thinking.
Well, thank you. We had good advice from our team of professionals that were part of our journey. Our lawyers, our doctors, the agencies. So I have to give some of the credit, or a lot of the credit, to them for opening our eyes to that conversation. When we started the process, we were new intended parents like everybody else. So these were all new concepts for us.
Yeah. And how do you see that changing, Rich? How do you see that changing now? Because you probably have many more requests for that.
Absolutely. It's been a phenomenal shift in the field. And, I have the luxury of having joined a firm that had already existed, a third-party assisted reproduction firm. So our experience goes back to 1992. I started in the business in 2006, but having talked with our senior partners at the time who've since retired, back then, 99% of all egg donation arrangements were anonymous. There might have been a handful here and there that were with friends or family members, and so those were obviously known donor situations, but most egg donations at that time through agencies and such were all anonymous, based a little bit in part on that fear. And just because that's kind of all we knew, we had decades of experience with closed adoptions prior to that. And that's just what we knew at the time. Then if you fast forward from like the early 90s to the mid 2000s, we started to see, a slightly higher percentage, maybe 5% became known arrangements, maybe 10%. Then, just as of even 8 years ago, maybe that number was 15 or 20%. But what we see in our practice today, and this is a number that's constantly changing, I think we're probably closer to the 70% range of known. So out of all of our egg donations, I'd say 70% are known donor arrangements. So it's changed dramatically. And that change has happened in large part in the last 5-6 years, I'd say. So if you asked me 5 years ago, I might have said 35% or 40% and then 50%, but it's increasing a lot. There's several reasons for that. Among others, I think there's growing awareness and understanding of the benefits for the child. There's also no way to really guarantee anonymity anyway, right?
Right.
So why try?
Right.
Why try? Let's just make sure we let everybody know.
Yes.
There's no way to promise anonymity. So there's 23andMe, Ancestry.com, there's Google face recognition. Who knows? There's all kinds of things. So let's just face this head on. And most people are aware of that. And I think a lot of donors are very comfortable with the concept now as well. So you've got parents thinking more about it, donors thinking more about it. So more and more people are open to this idea.
So do the donors come to you and say, I really want to have an open relationship, or are they just flexible about the type of match?
For the most part, when we are introduced to the participants, it's a referral from a clinic or an agency. The match has already been made and they've already established that they're going to be known or not known. We do get cases, though, where perhaps the donor has been listed anonymously at first, but as we begin the contract stage of their journey, the donor will call and say, I'm open to whatever level of openness the parents are. Or sometimes the parents will present that to us. And so it may have been, the match might have been made as an anonymous arrangement, but as the conversation actually starts, once the legal work really gets started, then we do find from time to time that the donors or the parents are saying, look, we're open to more if everybody's comfortable. So that's happening frequently now.
That's fantastic. That's really fantastic for everyone. And, ultimately for the children, right? Because we have this opportunity to do something nice and think about something for the children so that they have access. And, all the newest research is really showing us that as children get older, they're really curious. And sometimes they want to pursue it, sometimes they don't, but they have that information. And if they're curious about medical information, if they're curious to meet, if they're curious about culture, whatever they want to know, they have that available. And that's just such a nice thing to give to the children. I think it might be harder for, and you probably see this in your practice, for women who have infertility problems, right, than for a gay couple who don't have that concern or that loss involved, and also for people are new to the treatment. Maybe they're just realizing they're infertile and this has not been something that they're accustomed to understanding. Do you find that parents struggle when they talk to you about this, that they're kind of struggling with the idea? Do you find that they're just kind of accepting that this is eventually what their children are going to want?
We do find from time to time intended mothers in particular are struggling with the concept. For the most part, it's intended mothers, sometimes intended fathers as well. When they're new to it and they haven't had a lot of time to really digest this information, it can be a difficult concept to discuss. But what I find is more and more in our field, all the allied professionals are aware of this conversation, aware of these issues, and discussing it. So they're getting this information not only from lawyers, but consultants and professionals like yourself, agencies as well. So we're finding less and less of those instances where people are coming to the table really afraid or unsure. It does still happen from time to time, but I think, not to pat ourselves on the back, I think the industry, the field as a whole, is doing a better job of approaching this topic with clients as they enter the process.
So when they come to you, they're already thinking about this, and they're already thinking about, this is something that I want to do. What do you usually advise them to put into their legal contracts? Because there really is so much, right? Are we going to stay in touch with the donor over time? Are we going to ask for medical information? What about the future? There's so many things I suspect that people can add into that contract.
Right. So in an egg donor agreement, several areas of the contract touch on these future related concepts. So we touch on the potential for exchanging medical information, if necessary, in the future. In an anonymous arrangement, there's still that provision where we discuss exchanging medical information. It just gets exchanged, if needed, through the clinic or through the attorneys in the future and not directly with each other. But as we explore everyone's comfort level with this concept of contact or communication, we can also discuss the possibility of signing on to a donor sibling registry or similar type of registry where it's essentially a portal for intended parents and donors to communicate with each other, and it can remain anonymous for them. So they can actually have direct contact in an anonymous way, so that if they do need to talk, get information, exchange medical information, there's another way to do it. But more and more, once you broach the subject of contact and communication in the future, we get into other areas of how they might be in touch with each other. So the other aspects of the contract that we're touching on are not just exchanging medical information, but future contact. Whether there will be any, what are the parameters around it? Would it be through a registry? Would they perhaps exchange an anonymous email address so they can communicate directly, but not through a registry? Or would they just be willing to exchange contact information? And then if so, when? Would they exchange that information in the contract itself? Would they exchange information after the retrieval is completed, or exchange that information after there's been a birth of a child? Which is really sort of the most relevant time point. I mean, if a child doesn't result from the process, there may not be a need for future communication, right? So we have a lot of people sort of opting for that one. We do also talk about, in addition to just contact with each other, we also address the issue of, is the donor willing to be contacted by the child if the child is curious? So we are adding that clause to a lot of contracts these days. I would say 75% of the open donations are allowing for this possibility that the child could contact the donor. And so, we're asking the donor, is she willing to be contacted in the future? So we actually broach that subject, and the way that we explain it to intended parents is, look, you can say to your child, you did everything you could to leave the door open to future contact. There's no way to guarantee that there will be a meeting in the future, but the best you can do as an intended parent at this point is leave the door open as wide as you can, so that possibility exists.
It's so nice for parents to be able to have that. I'm sure it's so helpful for them to know that they've done everything they can for their children, because that's ultimately what we all want, right? And we think about children's health. And this is one more piece of the puzzle to really make sure that we know. And, also for the child's medical information. I mean, I'm sure we are over years are going to discover so many more things. Donors are young and healthy when they donate, but we don't know what they're going to develop over time. So it's so important, even just kind of for that medical piece.
Absolutely. I'm in full agreement.
And what about because you have an international law firm, Rich, I was wondering about that. What about international regulations? Because you see people from all over the world who have all different sorts of, combinations of things they have to deal with, and they're dealing with sometimes American fertility clinics. So it must be very complicated.
There are certainly a number of other rules and regulations to consider in this field when you have intended parents from other countries, perhaps coming to the U.S. to engage in assisted reproduction, including egg donation and surrogacy. In quite a number of countries, they have codified into their law that the child has a right to know. And this is evolved out of adoption legal circles, but it's parlayed into assisted reproduction to the extent that they acknowledge assisted reproduction. So we have a number of countries that would essentially require the intended parents to engage an open donor because that's what they require there. So in many of these arrangements, when they come to the U.S., although we will get them declared and confirmed as legal parents here in the U.S., when they go back home with their baby, they may have to do further legal work to confirm their parental rights in their home country and to get citizenship for that child in the home country. And if they haven't met their home country's rules and requirements regarding open donation, they could have an issue getting their parental rights confirmed. So it's something that we factor into our initial advice when we meet the intended parents. So for certain countries, Australia is one, some other countries in Europe have this requirement as well. We make sure that they are aware they need to match with an open donor. On the flip side, there are some countries where having an open donor would create massive legal hurdles for them.
Wow.
So in those countries, they have to consider matching with an anonymous donor or taking the risk and just matching with an open donor for the sake of the child. That's a whole other podcast probably right there.
So do you have to prove that legally? I mean, do you have to provide paperwork to say this person's open or this person's going to be anonymous or...
Yes, in some countries, you may have to provide a copy of the egg donation agreement or perhaps an affidavit from the doctor or the lawyer that was involved in the process.
It's so complicated. And what about foreign donors? Is there any, and I know that there are a lot of people out there who are probably worried about the lack of regulation in the U.S., right? There's no tracking system for donors. And so any egg bank or sperm bank or agency can say, as far as I know, this donor's only donated 3 or 4 times, but there's no way to track it, right? So people very often will say, what can I do about that? What if I get a donor from, New Zealand or from Australia? Would that help me? Is that even possible?
Is the question, would that help them control the number of donations that were done and minimize the risk of having,
many
related
siblings.
children
Yes.
out there? Yeah, this concept is called consanguinity. Yeah, fancy word. Maybe. It depends on the regulations in that country, but it doesn't prevent that donor from donating in other countries. If she wants to, donate more, I suppose she could. That's an area we have a lot more work to do in, not only in the U.S. but globally.
Yeah. And even in some countries where there are tracking systems, it's not bulletproof either. People are still kind of getting around it. So it's really not possible to control, which I guess brings us back to this importance of disclosure, right?
Absolutely. So the other way around this, or at least to help prevent problems, is to have that conversation with your children and let them know that, if they meet someone, in this day and age, it's possible that child was conceived through assisted reproduction. So knowing just a little bit about where things occurred, where the donation took place, and what state the child was born or year, then you can help at least sort of triangulate that way, even if you don't have a tracking system. So it's just better to have that conversation with the children up front.
Right. Do you have people who are interested in using donors from abroad?
That does come up from time to time. We've had a few where they might find donors in Brazil or Argentina. We've had a couple from other places as well. But we do see that from time to time. Most intended parents, though, that we work with are engaging with donors here in the U.S. There are some complications that have to be considered when parents are matching with donors from other countries, and that is, the donor still needs to be screened according to FDA guidelines. The donor still needs to be able to get into the U.S. for the procedures, for the cycle and the procedure itself. We've seen some donors that were not able to get in, and that was usually just from a lack of planning. So that can be overcome with proper planning, but it's something that takes a little bit of extra work.
Mm-hmm. So do you usually tell your clients that it's not advisable to go through all that to try to find a donor from outside of the U.S.?
I wouldn't say that. I would just say that there are some additional hurdles to clear if that's what they're considering.
Mm-hmm.
My job is to guide them and advise them, not tell them what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, unless it's something illegal, right? But if it's just more difficult, then, that's not a reason not to do it. Mm-hmm. So if that perfect donor is from some other country, that's the parent's personal choice. So we will, work on how to make that possible.
And then what about known donors who are related? Like sometimes, somebody will want to use their sister or a cousin. Do you see many of those contracts, or do you see that increasing as well?
We do see this from time to time. I would say the most common situation is that folks will come to us with an idea that they'll use a sister or a family member or even a friend, somebody close, as a donor. And then we talk them through some of these issues, some of the things they need to consider. We always encourage them, especially in a situation like that where they're so close, that they're all getting proper psychological consultations and evaluations. So they have the opportunity individually to all think through these issues before they go forward. So what will happen is they'll approach us, they'll say this is what they want to do, and then, probably half the time those matches don't go forward after they carefully think through all the issues that are involved. There's some concepts to sort of get comfortable with when you're using a sister as a donor.
Yes.
Is she the donor? Is she the anti-donor? So it gets a little complex. So if they can clear those hurdles, think through those things and still feel comfortable, then we'll move forward with them. And then there would be some variations in how we would draft the contract in those types of arrangements, because you typically will have provisions in a sort of a standard sort of agency donor arrangement that says that there's no contact between the family. She can't contact the child without the parents' consent. But if she's a family member, they're going to be in regular contact like family members are.
Yes.
So we have to modify the contract to fit the actual situation.
So it sounds like what you're saying, Rich, is that a lot of these situations might seem very complicated, but they're all kind of doable. If the parents really want to pursue a particular avenue, you can kind of try to find a way to make it work for them.
Yes. As long as they're going forward, fully informed, fully aware of the issues that are involved, and they've had psychological consultations and clearance, as well as all the other standard clearances, the medical clearance, of course, and legal clearance, then yes, they can work.
That's great. And do you see any changes happening that you think can be helpful to donor conception? I know there's, quite a lot of difficulty legally now with surrogacy because of, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And so we have to be careful about that. And what about with egg donation? Do you think that there's any changes legally that we're seeing that might impact on family building?
No, generally speaking, the changes that we're seeing regarding egg donation and surrogacy are more welcoming laws being developed. A lot of the laws revolving around egg donation and surrogacy are simply that there's no law in the state, so it's allowed because it's not prohibited. But there are some states with case law where the courts have entertained disputes between parties and ruled on certain issues. So that can provide some sort of guidance on this issue of assisted reproduction. And then there are states with some statutory treatment of surrogacy. Most of the statutes deal mainly with surrogacy and sperm donation. Fewer of them deal directly with egg donation, but as the collective legal consciousness is increasing, the more statutes that are evolving, they're now actually addressing egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation, and surrogacy. So the trend is toward more legal protection, more legal comprehensive protections in place.
Wow, that's really
So
interesting.
it's a positive trend.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. Well, and it's so important, right, that we all feel like we could be protected, our embryos are protected, and we don't really have to, we can move forward and not worry so much about building our families and all the legal ramifications that might seem so scary out there.
Yes. The legal landscape is becoming more and more well developed so that all of the parties are well protected.
That's great. Well, it's really nice to hear all of that, Rich, and thank you so much. I think that's a good place for us to wrap up, but it sounds like you've put everybody's mind at ease, and everybody out there, hopefully you feel comforted by all these things that Rich is saying, because it's really possible to build your family, and maybe it takes a little maneuvering, but it sounds like there's so many options for so many families.
Absolutely. Fully agree. And it's my pleasure to be here, Lisa.
Well, thanks so much, Rich. And if someone wants to reach you, how do they reach you?
So you can reach me at our website, www.iflg.net, or feel free to email me at rich@iflg.net. Happy to help you.
Okay, terrific. Thanks again. And for all of you out there, please subscribe, because that's how we keep going, and that's how you'll hear about more episodes. So thanks for joining us.
We were kind of between two, and then we found out about SART, went to SART, and we're like, okay, now we know exactly what to do.
Also at that stage, we learned a lot about, I guess, what we had to start thinking about in terms of our egg donor. We also did genetic testing on ourselves to learn about whether there's